All right, you should see a little record button in your upper left-hand corner. All right, thank you guys for coming on out this evening. We are going to be taking on a relatively big theological question. This has been one of those questions that has come up in one form or another from time to time throughout pub theology, not just here, but in other calls I've done this sort of stuff in. Though I will say this is probably the most entertaining way it has ever been brought up. So I applaud whoever filed this question because it was hilarious. And I'm hoping that even though I'm generally not that funny, I will have worked a little bit of humor into today's response to the question. For those of you who do not know the question is, what body do I get with the resurrection? The one I had when I died or the one when I was 25? So this person clearly thinks very highly of their 25-year-old self, or at least their 25-year-old body. So let's go ahead and begin the fun of screen sharing. See if I can get this to work, because this is always an adventure in technology. Thinking about cooperating.
Ding, ding.
There we go. All right. And just so you guys, what in the world?
Oh.
I know. Jokes in there. We got to hit the jokes. All right. Just so you guys know, as you can see, I can see some of you, but not all of you. And I'm going to shrink you so you can see everything I wrote. Because some of you guys I know are visual people, which means if you have a question, you've got to interrupt me, okay? Because I will just keep going. And everyone who knows me will know that I will just keep going. All right, so please interrupt. And I have a set, so whoever says something should jump forward. So, body of resurrection, what body do we get with the resurrection? The one we had when we died or the one when we were 25? So we asked this question, we should look at evidence. And I always like to take a few minutes and review what the evidence should look like for us as Lutherans and as Christians. So, well, I know most of my biblical scholars out there would cringe at me calling it this. I like to sort of think of it as primary source evidence and secondary source evidence whenever we're asking a theological question. So the first place you should go as a Lutheran, and I know this will stun some Lutherans, is in fact the Bible. Then, if the Bible can't give a satisfactory answer, okay? For example, you go to the Bible wondering, does Adam and Eve have belly buttons? You don't know why that's funny, think through that. Then you have to go and go, man, it doesn't seem to have a conclusive position on this. So you know where you go to the Confessions. And you go, did Luther write anything about belly buttons? By the way, the answer is no. No, he doesn't at all. So then you go to an era called the Patristics. Now, at this point...
Still hungry, huh?
Scale what? Anyways, so the Patristic Arrow is one of these things that about half the Lutheran Church would be like, yes, that's absolutely what we do. And the other half would be like, The Patristics is a weird little era. Okay, what it is a group of folks who would be old enough to have probably met an apostle. So they could have sat and been like, hey, Saint Matthew, when you knew Jesus, what did he say? Okay, meaning that they could oscillate between the early versions of what we will later know as the Bible and checking it by apostles, or at least in their case, the Patristic era starts when the last apostle dies. So if me and Rich knew St. Matthew and we got a question and we looked at the Bible and I said, well, I think it said this, and he said, well, no, I think it said that, we could sit down and talk and say, okay, so when I talked to St. Matthew, he said this passage meant this. And Rich could say, no, he said that. Okay? So I personally think you give a little bit more oomph to the Patristics, obviously not as much as you would to the Bible. You don't give it nowhere near what you'd give to the Confessions, but the Patristics are a handy area to look at because often in this time period, you're getting a lot of pastoral care questions. How do we as Christians deal with this pastoral care issue? Which you don't always find a ton of that in the Bible, and you definitely don't find hardly any of that in the Confessions. And so with pastoral issues, it's really often good to look and say, okay, so if I got this question, maybe someone in 100 AD did too, okay? Those are what I call sort of primary sources. And the secondary sources is modern theologians. Let's go see what modern theologians think about this. And then I always like to remind people that one of the things we as Lutherans believe is because God is always creating and recreating, because God is active in the world, okay? One of the authorities we believe in is the people of God, meaning us all, okay? One of the reasons the church has any authority isn't because we have smart theologians who tell us things. That's not why the church has any authority. It is not because we have holy people like bishops and pastors. We have authority in the church because we represent a large number of folks who are loving, caring, faithful people who are discerning together where the church should go and where God is calling the church. That's why the ultimate authorities in the Lutheran Church, or at least the ELCA, is not the presiding bishop. No matter what anyone tells you, it is not Paul Erickson. It is not me, for goodness sakes, which is a really good idea. But it is you all. Congregations call pastors. Delegates from congregations elect bishops. Bishops that are elected from those people then elect a presiding bishop. All the people who go to a synodus, nationwide sort of assembly, they elect all the positions out at, West Higgins Road in Chicago, okay? All the authority lays with the people of Christ because we believe it is amongst the people of Christ that the Holy Spirit's active. Doing things like fighting for justice, doing things like bending history towards freedom, towards justice, towards compassion, okay? So that's always something we should double check. And that's little different than just like popularity or a poll, because you're not just taking into account the people who live now, but the people who lived before us, always looking forward to what is the implication for the people who live generations ahead, okay? So it's a different way than looking at than like politics. Have I completely bored you all now? No? Yes?
No.
Nope, you got it.
All right, we're still there. All right. So let's go to the Bible first, right? Primary source. Okay, and here's our thing. We got 1 Corinthians 15, 35 through 58 is awesome because someone literally asked Paul, an apostle, well, technically he's not because he wasn't part of the original group, but almost an apostle, go ahead and ask him, what body do we get after we die? So when we found this, I was like, score, this is easy. Except for then I read what he said. And what he said was, you fools, why are you asking me this? You have so many other issues. See, 1 Corinthians, they were in trouble. The reason he's writing to them is not because they're good, wonderful folks. It's because they've been awful to each other as a community, because the original service of church and the original communion was part of a meal. So basically, in modern terms, everyone would get together for an all-day potluck. Okay? And at some point in that potluck, in fact, probably at multiple points in the potluck, like once every hour, someone would get up, do the words of institution, and pass around communion. And so it was a sort of multi-hour festival that occurred once a week. But here's the thing. Sunday wasn't a protected day. Like, there wasn't a concept of weekends. There hadn't been a labor movement yet, right? And so what happened was this. The rich folks could get together earlier in the day because they didn't have to work as many hours as your folks working out in the fields, or your folks working sort of in crafts, because obviously we don't have factories yet. And so the rich folks were like, hey, our food is like really expensive and really yummy, and those poor people's food is like, well, poor people's food. See, what we should do is we all talk amongst ourselves as rich folks. We'll meet at like 2 in the afternoon, get the festival started, eat all our food, leave before the poor people come in, because I don't want to have to eat their food. And Paul is like mad as heck at them for doing this. Mm-hmm. It seems part of Corinthians is also that they probably filed, thinking very righteously of themselves, because you have this sort of rich, educated group, a series of theological questions, of which this is one of them. And so this is all part of a whole rant, because Paul's literal answer is, what you fools are spending time on the wrong thing. So that doesn't actually answer our question. It does, however, bring us to say, we maybe shouldn't get too far out here on the question itself. However, if we do continue on and we go, you know what, okay, the Corinthians have their own issues, we do have other passages. We have Romans 6:5, for we have been united with him in a death like his, we certainly also will be united with him in a resurrection like his. Okay? This is a key thing, even though it doesn't give you a hint of what you might look like. that maybe we could go to Jesus, see what he looked like after the resurrection, and if we are going to have a resurrection like his, then maybe we could know what that looked like, right? Now, granted, I personally think this is beginning to become a little bit of a logic stretch, but, you know, it's fun. So if you were to do that, you can go to Luke and you can see at the road to Emmaus that the apostles are on their way. Jesus meets them, talks to them for a period of time, and they don't recognize who he is. Okay? Which would indicate that he is similar, because when he says, I am Jesus, they suddenly realize, oh my goodness, you are Jesus. So he must look different enough that he's not immediately recognizable, but same enough that once he says who he is, you can sort of look at him and see. Sort of like if you've been away from high school for like 20 years and you run into someone that maybe was an acquaintance or loosely a friend who you haven't seen since high school, you might look at him and be like, man, you look so familiar, but I can't begin to place you. But then they say, oh yeah, did you go to James Madison High School? And you go, yeah, I did. And all of a sudden, boom, you're like, I see it. You were that kid, 3 rows behind me in math class. Similar story coming out of John, because Jesus... I'm sorry, what?
Okay. Sorry, I know you said it's okay to interrupt. What if they were just in a state of shock after seeing the Savior died? And
yep.
And they didn't recognize him because they just assumed he's dead, so it can't be him. So mentally, they just figured he must be someone we haven't met before.
Absolutely. And that is one of the major critiques against the argument being made. Because the only other thing that falls in the same arena as the road to Emmaus is the appearance to Mary Magdalene, in which Mary Magdalene's hanging out at the garden. He shows up. She assumes he's the gardener. They talk. He eventually says, you realize I'm Jesus. She goes, oh my goodness, I see it now. So there's 2 ways to interpret either of those stories, right? One is that he either looks really different, or 2, they are grief-stricken and completely are not looking for him. Those are both absolutely valid ways to look at it, which is also, I think, another sort of strike against going down this road from a biblical standpoint, okay? Because I think the argument, well, they're just grief-stricken and they weren't looking for him, is a very good and strong argument. In fact, their argument has not just that problem, but has a second problem if you were to try to make this sort of Romans, Luke, John argument, which is that John, a few things later, after Mary Magdalene sees him in the garden, then has him appear to doubting Thomas, right? Well, to the apostles and then doubting Thomas. Well, in that scenario, they know exactly who he is, right? Because he comes through the door and says, and they're scared because they're like, oh my goodness, it's Jesus. He's a ghost because he walked through a door and he's like, peace be with you guys. It again gets further complicated because they go and they tell Thomas, right? And then Thomas is like, oh, I doubt. And then they bring it back and they go back in, they talk to Thomas, and he goes up to Thomas and says, put your finger here in my hand where the nail went. Put your hand to my side, do you believe? Right? And then there's, of course, the famous question, did you believe because you saw this? Well, that sort of contradicts the idea that Jesus is so unrecognizable that they couldn't get who he was, because in that scenario, they did.
Right.
So there is a line of argumentation you will find. I'm going to argue that it's really if you wanted to go down that road, I can respect it. I do think there are a lot of legitimate critiques of it, however, both under there's a completely legitimate explanation for what's going on in Luke and John, plus you have this other John issue, plus Luke and John only work in this way if you believe that Romans' statement is very literal and referring to Luke and John's statements later. So that's a lot of things that all have to be correct for this argument to stand. Any one of those fall and the whole argument collapses. With that said, I'm always very cautious about anyone making any argument from the Bible in which you are stitching together 3 passages from 3 different books in relatively unrelated stories. Okay. But can you? Yeah, you can go there. It's not the strongest of arguments. So I'd say Bible's mostly inconclusive. Maybe you squint and go this direction, but you could easily decide, nah, it's pretty much inconclusive. So after the Bible, where do we go? The Confessions! However, the Confessions are crickets, nothing but crickets. Do you get the joke with the picture?
Quiet.
No? What?
It's quiet.
No,
Nothing but
no,
cricket.
no.
Quiet. No?
I'm going for a more literal interpretation. Look at the bat.
Oh, the sport.
Cricket sport.
Yes! Cricket, right? This popped up as a possibility on the little design manager. I was like, oh, this is cool. Because they thought I meant crickets like cricket. Like the weird British game, I don't begin to understand how it works. All right. So then we go to the Patristics. Perhaps they could help us, maybe. However, they're really not any help. The reason that the patristic mothers and fathers are not particularly helpful at this is because mostly they don't take on the question. They have bigger questions to deal with. Mainly the patristic era, the huge controversy is, what is Jesus? Is he divine? Is he human? Has he been around since the time of God, or was he created when Mary gave birth to him? And if he wasn't created and has been around since the beginning of time, like John indicates, then was he fully human back then, or was he only divine back then? They were really stuck on these issues. And that is what a lot of patristics got into. However, two patristic writers, one's name is Origen, the other one Tertullian, who famously debate each other via a whole slew of letters back and forth over the nature of the Bible, do spend a short period of time in their debate going down the rabbit hole of saying, well, what body do you think you have? Okay? They go down, they actually take on this question. So Origen ends up taking the position that at the end of the day, we are essentially energy. Again, they don't really have a concept of energy back then, so he uses terms like rays of eternal light. Because he sees a complete separation between the body and the soul, so the resurrection would be, for Origen, the soul but not the body. But he would argue that the ray of light, because it would be contained, would be bodily in and of itself. Tertullian, because these guys are sort of adversaries, so they have a tendency to each go to an extreme, goes to the point where he's like, no, you get the body you had when you died. He actually goes all the way to the extreme of saying, if you're a soldier and your foot gets cut off in war, you better go grab it so you don't lose it, because it won't find you.
What happens if you get blown up and it's everywhere?
Well, this is the ancient times, so that was very rare that you got exploded. Okay, right? So that's a very good question. I would love to go to Tertullian and be like, so what happens then? Because I'm feeling like you either are in a lot of trouble, or you're like T1 Terminex guy, or not Terminator. Terminator dude, remember? Just come back together. Here's the problem. Here's the problem with this. Well, both of them are patristic parents, and both of them have very good writings. Both of them get declared heretics. Origen gets declared a heretic because he goes to this weird place in which he believes in the recycling of the energy of the soul through a series of reincarnations and a series of levels of heaven and levels of hell, and goes to a weird place. Tertullian gets declared a heretic because he embraces what we would now know as a really highly literalist view. And so he believed that the Bible should be turned into like a legal document that should be enforced upon others. Okay? Which, by the way, got him declared a heretic in the early patristic era, got him kicked out of the church. You can argue that their positions as to your resurrection and what you would look like are directly reflective of the heresy they were removed from the church for teaching, right? Because you can say, well, if he's this ultra literalist, that's how he got to a place where he worried whether or not you collected all your toes after the battle, right? That's a logical argument to be made. And you could argue that Origen, because of his sort of heresy of the complete separation of body and mind, denies the bodily resurrection because being rays of movable light is not exactly bodily. Okay? Now, just because someone's a heretic doesn't mean they're wrong. Luther was declared a heretic too, guys. But you have an argument to be made that you're relying on folks who are less than reliable to fall on. So I'd say, again, the patristics are like, Well, there's arguments out there. Are they good? I don't know. Modern theologians, maybe they will save us. Oh no, we have crickets again. In fact, we have one giant cricket, because you can like Google this. Modern theologians are like, I'm not touching it. This is one of the few times I'm like, okay, modern theologians, I sort of understand. Then the people of God, maybe we have a consensus out there. The answer is no,
No.
but lots of weird stuff you can find on the internet if you do Google it. I tried that. So you will find a lot of weird, mostly Pentecostal evangelicals who have books that they will sell you to tell you exactly what your body's going to look like, in case you're wondering. So that is sort of what that is. Now, personally, because I always like to throw it out there, I would say you're probably somehow different. That seems to make sense to me, but I would have no real evidence to point at. So take that for what it is. It's mostly just theological speculation, which means if you completely disagree with me, that's totally cool. Because one of the things that is awesome about being a Christian, particularly an ELCA Lutheran Christian, is when we don't know, we have the humility and honesty to say, we don't know, the Bible's unclear, the Patristics are all over the map, modern theologians are quiet, the people of God are split, we don't know, and when we don't know, the answer is, believe
We
what
have a
you
beer.
want. We have a beer. That is a good answer. No, we have a beer, and you can
And
believe
contemplate
whatever
further.
you want. And contemplate further. You have, and this is an important part of what I think we often lose. As of one of the best things about being a ELC Lutheran is that the default for the church is humility, and to say, people of God, go for it. Believe what you want. And in 7 generations, we can revisit this. And if the people of God have come to a conclusive answer, then guess what? That's authority. And if 7 generations from then, we realize that was stupid, then that new idea can be authoritative. And that's okay, because we're human trying to decipher the will of a divine, loving, caring, compassionate, merciful God who knows we're trying our hardest. So there we go. Questions, thoughts, random theological speculations.
My random thought is, does it really matter? I mean, if resurrection is resurrection, does it really matter what our body is like? Because we won't die again.
Right?
Yeah.
I kind of want to say yes, in the aspect of what we do with our bodies can be, it seems like a judgmental avenue for people. Let's just play it safe and say someone gets a tattoo. Some people argue that it's a desecration of God's creation when they get a tattoo. I'm not sure how that started or whatever, but apparently people had a problem with tattoo, more of a cultural thing. People.
Leviticus.
Leviticus.
Yeah.
There is a, you can take Leviticus. I'm gonna put it that way. You can take Leviticus, one line out of Leviticus that you can decide to interpret to be against tattoos. Okay. With that said, there are a lot of things in Leviticus for anyone who, because I've run into this before. My question to the anti-tattoo groups out there are always like, so can we go to the next 4 lines of Leviticus? Because I want to know what you thought about that. Because 9 out of 10 times they haven't read the next 4 lines. It doesn't really matter where we are. But which is always why I then go back to if you can only find it one place in the Bible and you got to squint to find it, are you reading the Bible or are you reading into the Bible? Sorry. Didn't mean to interrupt.
No, it's just like clarifying the point. I guess where I'm coming from is that what we do with our body somehow affects us when we get our quote unquote new body, when we go enter heaven or enter the afterlife, heaven, hopefully. And it seems like it's an excuse to control.
Absolutely.
Without actually exploring the idea that maybe we don't know, like as you pointed out. what that body's going to be. So what we're doing to our bodies may not have anything to do with what's going to happen to us in the next life.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
What if our best self is in the pattern buffer, and then Scotty goes and reactivates the transporter, and we reappear?
Right? We have no clue how that plays out.
You know,
I
I'm just thinking
TV
that's
show
the
The
whole
100, and they-
avenue.
Yeah, you are.
I
The
just
other
finished
quick-
the finale for the 100, so spoiler alert if any of you are watching that.
The
You're
other
watching this,
question,
Anya?
Matt,
I said my husband's watching the 100, not right this second, but he's been watching it. I
Oh,
don't know
well, then
what.
maybe I shouldn't tell you how it ends, but
No, I missed
He said he's at the end. Did you finish it?
Yeah, yes, I finished.
Oh, he finished it. So you're
okay. So at the end of the show, they go total origin on it because an alien species brings them all up as rays of light to a single consciousness. Like, it was hilarious for me because I'm like, oh my goodness, someone broke open Origin's view of like heaven here.
Well, there is talking about the side of our bodies. I mean, it does talk about our bodies being a temple. So how we
Absolutely.
treat our bodies, therefore, it might be significant in how our bodies end up later.
And I would
Right.
say that you have a much better case to say that, like, if you're to make the argument that we need to treat our bodies well, okay, rather than trying to defer
Drink beer.
that to what it means as we drink beer, yes. As we refer that, rather than referring it directly to the resurrection, okay, that there is a lot in the Bible that says that we are both physical and spiritual people. And especially for the early Christians, and overwhelmingly in the Patristics, as they do spend a ton of time on this, they don't see that as something we can separate. And there was a lot of resistance in the Patristics of trying to, the sort of Roman view of the world that said you were made of soul, will, and emotion, or physical, emotional, and then sort of soul or will, which was the Roman view of the world, okay? And there was a lot of resistance among early Christians who were like, no, you can't. I mean, yeah, you can for classification reasons or to talk about things linguistically that can be helpful to talk about this sometimes, but they were very resistant to ever thinking that those could be divided. So particularly like when we talked about the idea of soul death versus immortal soul, Patristic Arrow was overwhelmingly on the soul death part because they never thought the soul could live outside the body. Now we have a consensus towards immortal soul in the sense of like you die, your soul goes up here, your body stays down here, and they get reunited later. Okay. But their big pushback against the immortal concept was this idea that they said you as a person are your body, you as a person are your soul, and those two live it as one. And therefore, to care for your soul, you also sort of got to care for your body. And to care for your body, you got to care for your soul. And modern science is starting to figure out that a lot of that's sort of true, right? Like if you are racked with guilt and depression and something like that because you're just going through a horrible state, we know your blood pressure is higher, right? Mm-hmm. We know that your heart rate goes through the roof. There's a reason that I can use my little like very cheapo Garmin thing here to figure out what my stress in the day is, and it's relatively reliable-ish because it can look at like, what's your heart rate and are you moving? So what's your heart rate when you're sitting down? Why is it this fast? You've got to be stressed, right?
Right.
Because there's this interplay between the physical, emotional, and spiritual. It's the same way that you can go to Buddhist monks, like you look at the Buddhist monks in Nepal, they can slow down their darn heart rates through meditation as a spiritual practice. And like for years, like people in the medical community were like, it's silly, that can't be done. And then they did tests and they're like, okay, never mind.
Matt, what about, so if we're going to move back to age 25, what about a 6-month-old child who dies? They don't move forward to 25.
Yeah.
Maybe they do.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know.
That's true.
Or
Well,
maybe
you
we
look
just
at people who are, born like with cerebral palsy or some, deformity that live in, to 25 or 30 or however long they live, but do they come back or when their body is brought up, is their body perfect our sense of perfect, or is it like, is it a state that they were born and lived in?
Right. And this is these sorts of questions that lead me to say that we are in some way fundamentally different while still being the same. Because I would, like, again, this is total speculation. I have zero evidence I'm standing on, okay? So I'm hesitant to even call this theology. I would argue that we are the perfect version of ourselves, which would be absolutely unrecognizable to all our spouses.
But your family meeting you in heaven is not going to know.
Our family would be like, who is this
Yeah.
person? And maybe that was us at 25. And maybe a thing that we never were.
Probably more accurate.
That's why we would sort of be recognizable, but only if you talk to us for a little bit, to even those who know us well.
Okay.
That would
Or
be
do
my
they-
guess.
Do we re-meet with the best of ourselves in that relationship, and you kind of shift as you go, if you meet everybody in the afterlife, do you shift as you go from here to there? And you're more of a consciousness than a physical being. So if everything's in God's own image, what is God black, white, Chinese? What does he look like? Or do we all look like what we want to see in the mirror? Is the reflection whatever it will be, and it's really not a true form. It's more of a spiritual existence.
Absolutely. And remember, like, even when you talk about relational, we have other passages. Because the Pharisees asked Jesus, hypothetically, there's this woman, she has all these husbands and all of them die. Who is she married to come death?
Yeah.
Which in that setting would have implied bodily resurrection. So who is she, who's her husband? And Jesus is like, seriously, guys? Seriously? And basically avoids the question and calls them out for, like, why are you trying to trick me? Everything will be different then. Stop with these sort of weird questions, guys. So again, I think that's sort of a hint that things will be different. Now, that doesn't mean I have a clue what it is.
I hope no one comes up to me and says, surprised to meet you here.
I imagine there'll be a lot of people who will say that to me.
You made the cut?
How low did they lower the bar?
They're drafted.
Who paid penance for you?
Bingo,
right.
Going all Catholic.
Good old Catholic right there.
Maybe they're not so wrong. I don't know.
So
I don't know. Before my mom passed away, she had a lot of questions about, that kind of, if you get cremated, if you choose to be cremated, how do you come back? And actually, I know several people that over time have said, I'm not being cremated because then I can't come back. I won't be lifted up as anything when I go to heaven, because there won't be anything left of me to reform.
So that's actually, and I was actually going to note that earlier. Thank you for bringing that up. So one of the places this really does, like, rubber hit the road, is with that exact question. I studied at the Oblate School of Theology in San Antonio, Texas for a while, which is a Catholic institution. Okay? And I actually got to know some of the Catholic lawyers down there. One of the things I grew up with, because San Antonio is an overwhelmingly Catholic area, okay? And I grew up every Christmas, really starting in Advent, the then Archbishop, Flores, would literally buy time on television during the major networks. And he would come out. It was always a simple video. He'd be sitting on his sort of like throne thing at the Archbishop place, and you'd focus in on him. And he would say, I need to remind you again, all of my flock, all of my people, Merry Christmas, Happy Advent, whatever you are celebrating, God is with you. And I need to remind you that one of the best Christmas gifts you can give anyone is organ donation. For many years, Catholics have taught or learned incorrectly that you will not have those body parts when you are raised. This has never been a teaching of the Catholic Church. This is something that has been spread as a rumor through different areas of Catholicism. And if you don't believe me, here's my driver's license. There's my organ donation card. Because particularly within Hispanic, but also Eastern European, like Polish and some parts of German Catholicism, it was a cultural thing where there was this really deeply held belief for generations on generations that if you got cremated, you wouldn't resurrect, or if you lost your foot, you wouldn't resurrect, or you'd resurrect without a foot. And it had gotten so bad in San Antonio, because again, most of the Catholicism of San Antonio is either German or Hispanic, that the Archbishop every year took it on, straight on, to his credit, in an attempt to encourage people to become organ donors. Because he knew that was one of the reasons San Antonio had such low levels of people signing up to be organ donors. And to his credit, that was like his pet project. And he must have spent millions of dollars, because this would come on like in the middle of Nickelodeon. On like a Friday night, you'd have Archbishop Flores reminding you that this is not true. And if your parents are telling you this, tell your abuelita that she's wrong. And Archbishop Flores said so, you know, for what it's worth. Like, it was just like, I could still remember these ads, because I was just like, I'm not Catholic, but that's impressive. Because clearly he's trying to do what's right for the community. And he's having to take this on TV, which means he's clearly got a group of folks who disagree with him. And strongly.
Well, and there's significant areas in not just the United States, but you have to cremate because you can't bury people. There's just nowhere to go with it unless you can only go up so far in mausoleums.
Absolutely. And there's just a practical space issue. Like, you go to the East Coast, like, go to New York City, you've run out of space. You can't build another spot.
You'd have to trust in grace.
Absolutely.
Whatever that being is, that God has already thought of that.
Absolutely. And if God can, right, we have no clue what the answer is. But again, if God defeated death, the devil, and sin, which is something we affirm at every confirmation, we affirm at every baptism, we affirm at every funeral, that God has already defeated death, the devil, and sin. Okay? Then surely he has figured out cremation and saw it coming. Okay? And if there's nothing we can do, because if you actually were to go on in Romans, past the whole nothing can separate me from Christ, the point of that entire statement is that neither death nor life nor things present nor things in the future nor things in the past nor height or depth, I'm totally butchering it at this point, but you know what I'm going for, right? Can separate us from the love of God. Why would we think cremation could do that? And so that's where I would go on that. And honestly, that has been the position of the Lutheran Church, and not just ELCA, but across the board of Lutheran churches. And it's even though there were whole times in history in which Catholicism as a group would have been like, no, it's not our position. If you had actually sat down with the canon lawyer, they'd be like, well, technically, yeah, you can cremate it. Even if all the priests were like, no, it can't be true. The canon lawyers would have been like, yes, it really is. Because there's just, for a long time in Catholicism, again, particularly in sort of Northeastern Europe, Poland areas, and then in Central and South American cultures and indigenous cultures to those areas, there was a lot of not wanting to get cremated thing that then fed into the Catholicism as Catholicism arrived in Spain. All right, any other questions? If I'm getting crickets, I'll stop recording, then we can talk about whatever. I'll take that as permission to hit the stop recording.